Today is Monday, March 18th, 2019, and I'm Marguerite Gong Hancock at the Computer History Museum, and we're thrilled to welcome Jack Wadsworth here for your oral history interview. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you.
So let's get started at the beginning. We're here to document your story of your life and the impact, the remarkable impact that you've had. So take us back to the beginning. Where were you born, when, where, and tell us what life was like in Fort Thomas, Kentucky.
Yeah. Well, Fort Thomas, Kentucky is a rather typical Midwestern small town. I'm very proud of the fact that it is Kentucky and not Ohio. I have always liked places that have a certain resonance and a feel of being a bit unique, and so place has always been important to me. In Fort Thomas, Kentucky, I grew up with a family that had been there for 4 generations. My great-great-grandfather was a watch case designer. He came from England, and he settled in Fort Thomas because Cincinnati and the southern part of Ohio in the early part of the century, the 19th century, was the watch industry of America. Not many people appreciate that. Hamilton, Ohio is the home of Hamilton Watch, and Bulova and Elgin, and it sort of goes on and on. But at a high level, our family was always entrepreneurial, small, private businesses, and you could imagine the range of different businesses that existed there. So I went to Highlands High School. I grew up with a big family, and like so many people of my generation, the idea of going someplace else to school was at the top of my mind. And Cincinnati, Ohio, which is a few miles away across the river, Ohio River, has a big Williams contingent, and such a pleasant thing. The director of admissions, I can still see his face, Fred Copeland, came to Highlands High School to interview. And I was captain of the football team, a pretty good student. I wanted to go east to school. And we talked for a half an hour, and Fred said, so what do you think? Jack, would you like to come to Williams? And I said, yeah, I think so. And he said, you're in. Can you imagine how refreshing those days were? I mean, give me a break. There was no admissions committee. He was it. And I mean, just a parenthetical. As a consequence, probably 3 generations of Williams graduates were basically picked by Fred Copeland. And what an amazing record. I mean, you ask how people get picked to do something. I mean, this guy just had an amazing ability to judge character and potential and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so that was the story on Williams. And my first wife, current wife, only wife, Susie Wadsworth, grew up down the street in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, and we met when we were 12. I crashed a slumber party. She looked pretty good, and that was that.
So, for the record, we would love to just get officially your full name, date of birth as well, and then also you mentioned these generations that really had an impact on you. And can you say a little bit more about your father and your mother and their work?
Yeah, sure. So I was born on September 12th, 1939, in Fort Thomas, Kentucky. John S. Wadsworth Jr. is my actual official name, and I became Jack fairly soon because my father and I wanted to have sort of different handles. I also have a name that I very carefully kept off of Wall Street, which is now pretty universal as my nickname, which is Speed.
What's the story on how you received that one?
I had an uncle who noticed that I was slow making progress as a young kid. You know, I didn't walk as quickly as others. I was, you know, diligent and thoughtful and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it was a sarcastic handle because in his opinion, I was slow. I think I've outlived that.
I think you proved him wrong.
Yeah, right. Anyway, my father was the president of the Wadsworth watch case company. He orchestrated the sale of that to Elgin Watch just before, you know, Timex would have put them more or less out of business. He then went to another family company called Littleford Brothers, which made road maintenance equipment, and he did that until he retired. And what was road maintenance equipment, he very creatively morphed into a high-speed mixing product that he licensed from a German company, and that's a whole long story. But I think the real point of my relationship with my father, and you know, it was a very close relationship. But when it came to the question of, Dad, what should I do with my life? He said, don't come into the family business. I did, and I've always been frustrated. And I suppose that's not an unusual outcome for a third generation. The expectations are high, the challenge is in some ways low, and by definition, you start off, you know, working on the factory floor, and you work your way up. And he never particularly liked that, and he didn't think he used his degree from the University of Wisconsin as well as he might have. And so as I reflect on the many bits of great advice he gave me, that was a very poignant one. And so I was kind of cut loose. And so I went to Williams with, you know, kind of a blank sheet of paper. I would suppose that the next most important influence on my life was my grandfather and grandmother, Wadsworth. My mother's family lived in Racine, Wisconsin, so I never really knew them well. But my grandfather, you know, had been a designer, a watch case designer, and his vision for me was engineering. And he did the first co-op program at the University of Cincinnati, and was determined. I mean, this is sort of a marvelous thing in, you know, 1953, 1954, you know, for a guy of his wisdom and stature to be absolutely totally convinced that the future was engineering. And my grandmother was just this really wise person. I mean, I remember she said a couple of things to me when I left for New York. One that still resonates was she used to call me Spence, which is my middle name. So when I think of her, I think of that. She said, Spence, in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, we've always assumed that people are honest until they do something to raise a question about that. She said, when you get to New York, I think you should reverse that. And boy, was that good advice.
How do you suppose she knew that?
Yeah. She's just a wise woman. So, and I think it's almost, you know, a 3-hour conversation. Our family has always been a central feature in our lives. Extended family. 3 families lived and worked together in Fort Thomas, Kentucky. The Stegmans, the Littlefords, and the Wadsworths. And we still get together every summer at a resort up in northern Ontario that we now own, which is another long story. And about 10 years ago, we did a video of all the family being interviewed. And the question was, family matters. And you can say family matters, you know, 3 ways. Family matters, family matters? Family matters? And it sort of is the, I would say, the glue that has been really very important to me, and I end up kind of being the leader of the family now, in the sense of buying this resort and keeping people sort of on the same track. And I feel that the importance of this video was the question that was posed, and I think it's a universal American, maybe global thing. When you grow up on the same block as all your cousins, you have a certain view of life, and you have friends, and you have sort of deep relationships. My generation left Fort Thomas. Our kids, therefore, don't know Fort Thomas, and their kids, our grandchildren, have no clue. And so the question in this video is, could Port Cunnington Lodge replace Fort Thomas, Kentucky as a place? And, you know, that's, I say, it's a long story, but just the end of that sort of monologue is that I think the normal family kind of, when you get split up, gets together for weddings and funerals, and that's a weekend, and everybody drinks too much, and not much communication takes place. But if you're together for a week, that's good. You get to know each other.
And every week, every year.
Every year. Last year we had 100. So,
this is just the Wadsworth.
No, Wadsworth, Stegeman,
the
Littleford.
three
I say
families
these
together.
three. And, you know, there's like everything in Kentucky. There's intermarriage, and there, you know, I don't think we have any cousins that got married. Close. Very Chinese, actually.
I was going to say, my family has 4-generation get-together every year.
Yeah.
Twice a year, actually. So thinking about the importance of your family, you had this Midwestern background with an emphasis on manufacturing and making things. And yet you decided to go to the East Coast, go to New York, of all places, and do investment banking. How did those square, those different views of enterprise? And
Yeah, okay. Well, again, a long story, but try and make it short. I went to Williams under the influence of my grandfather, and I enrolled in what was then a 3-2 program with MIT. So 3 years at Williams, 2 at MIT, and an engineering degree when you finished. I lasted 1 semester. It just didn't feel right. I mean, it was, you know, a bunch of really deep science that, you know, I liked, but it wasn't that interesting to me. And so I switched direction, and 2 things became passions at Williams. One was economics, and the other was art. If then had been now, I probably would have had a dual major. And the thing that really fascinated me was design. And so when it got to the end of the 4 years, and 1961 was the year I graduated, it was one of those sort of down years where there were almost no jobs. And half the class at Williams, you know, probably pretty much like today, is off to graduate school to do something in the academic world or law or something. So my best job, you know, going through the placement office was to be the understudy to the foreman in the Chevrolet plant in Buffalo. And I just didn't think that sounded very good. So I decided to go to business school. And then, not unlike now, it was unusual to go straight to business school from undergraduate, but I did. And so I would say my mentor, thought leader, had become the head of the economics department at Williams. And his name was Gates. In fact, it was Bill Gates, of all things. And he had a PhD from the University of Chicago. And I went in to see him. I said, Professor Gates, you know, business school. I've, you know, sort of looked at the list and talked to a few people, and it seems like Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, Chicago, maybe there are a few others, but that's the list. And I'd like to have you write a recommendation for me. he said, I will not write a recommendation to Harvard. And I said, Professor Gates, what's wrong with Harvard? He said, well, if you really want to learn, about how business works, you need to learn theory. You can't learn it through cases. You have to study accounting and finance and markets. And Chicago has the leading academics in that field, and every one of them does research, and they're doing the research that will be creating the financial markets of the future. And he had a marvelous stutter that he actually, wasn't severe, but he used it in class. He would hesitate on a word that he wanted everybody to remember forever. And he then said to me, he said, Jack, if you go to Harvard, you'll learn bullshit. And you can see, I never forgot.
It worked.
It worked. So anyway, I went to Chicago, and that was the, place where finance was being taught. And the hot jobs then were in the treasurer's office at Exxon, DuPont, General Motors, blah, blah, blah. So I got a summer internship at General Motors, and I discovered exactly after 3 months what I did not want to do for the rest of my life. I mean, those experiences are probably more valuable than the ones where you have an aha moment and see something you really do want to do. So I went back with a blank piece of paper and started researching finance. And that led me to Wall Street, and that led me to First Boston. So that was how I got there.
So before we get to Wall Street, you had other people at Chicago that, do you want to talk about any people who were mentors there or influential?
Well, I mean, of all things, I did some studying with Gene Fama, who was working on his PhD at the same time I was working on my MBA. And he was then he was actually doing the research that led to the conclusion that picking stocks actively produces a rate of return exactly equal to the index minus expenses. And that's his Nobel Prize last year. The professors that were just, really influencing to me were Merton Miller, who was just, a great thinker about financial theory. George Stigler, who was the sort of markets guru, and an absolutely amazing accounting professor who, I'll think of his name in a minute. He had a way of teaching accounting that made it captivating and fun and interesting and memorable. Sidney Davidson was his name. He actually became the dean for a while. And another little footnote while I was there, George Schultz was the dean. Yeah. And I knew him. He didn't know me. And we connected much later, obviously. So yeah, Chicago was I did okay at Williams, but I got good grades at Chicago because I liked what I was studying.
So you've narrowed in on finance. You decided in, was it 63 to go to First Boston?
Right.
Do you remember first assignments, very early days? What were you actually working on? And did it feel like you were in the right place?
First, First Boston was a unique enterprise. It was publicly traded in 1963, and it was the only investment bank securities firm that was publicly traded. And it was simply a matter of history and origin when all the firms that spun out of their commercial banking parents raised money privately. First Boston did a rights offering to their three parents, the First National Bank of Boston, Chase Bank, and Harris Trust. And as a consequence, $10 million was their starting capital. And, they probably had 100,000 shareholders. So it was this weird kind of thing that was publicly traded, and it had a series of leaders who were incredibly visionary. And one of the things I learned, this is hindsight, after I joined First Boston, there was something in the bylaws called Article 4 compensation. And while the partnerships would divide up the profits for the year and pay it out. I mean, nobody retained any capital in those days, and that's how they all got so rich. They would pay out the earnings every year. And Article 4 compensation said that there was a meeting at the end of each year, and that meeting was about what dividends to pay shareholders, and therefore the important question, what was left for the executive committee. And the executive committee was like the partners of Morgan Stanley, say. But the problem with that model at First Boston is that the rest of the people got paid like they were at Chase Bank. So there was this two separate worlds where the executive committee, which was 10 or 15 people, got very wealthy, and there was no equity, no participation down the line. Anyway, that's kind of the end of the story. That's sort of why I left First Boston and joined Morgan Stanley. But the good thing about First Boston in those days was the fact that they had a training program. The other firms, you just went there and started doing something, and you ended up with a deal or whatever it was, and so you sort of learned by doing it. And an awful lot of the young staff had not been to business school, so you had college graduates who were working their way up to be partners. And the great thing about the training program, at the time I was sort of miserable because you'd spend a month on the trading desk and then a month in the cage and,
rotating around.
Everything, yeah. One little anecdote that I will never forget, I had all this, stuff embedded in my head, the theory of finance. And Milton Friedman, of course, was, the ultimate guru at Chicago in those days. And he had all this stuff about the money supply and monetary policy and fiscal policy didn't work, blah, blah, blah. And so I was sitting on the Treasury bill trading desk for 3 days, and the Treasury bill trader is one of these guys who, he probably didn't graduate from high school. His name was Charlie Marasco. God, I can still see him. I said, Charlie, when you're trading Treasury bills, how do you think about the rate of growth of the money supply? He said, young man, what are you talking about? I haven't a clue. And of course, there's a great lesson. I mean, traders, the better they are, probably the less they know, right? So they're not distracted by a lot of theories. Anyway, that training program was great, and of course I ended up in the investment banking department, which is where I wanted to be, and the president of the firm, there were 21 professionals in the entire investment banking department on one floor at 20 Exchange Place in New York City. And the president of the firm, a guy who became, I would say, another really important mentor, his name was Paul Miller, handed out assignments. And so the first thing I did was to write a list of every deal I could think of in Wall Street. And after I had done one, if he walked out of the office with another one of those deals, I wouldn't raise my hand. And the first one, was a bond issue for the Boston Gas Company.
What was the scale? Do you remember? Just to get
$20 million.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I remember that is that there was a CEO named Eli Goldston. It was actually a subsidiary of something called Eastern Gas and Fuel. And they owned a barge line on the river, and they owned a coal company, and they owned the Boston Gas Company. And God, I was 23 years old. And I went up to sort of be the junior guy on the deal. And in the meeting, he said, so I don't know much about Wall Street, but a prospectus and a bond issue for a $20 million deal just sounds really boring to me. can you think of some way to make this interesting? And so, I mean, actually, I can remember it was my idea. There was no summary prospectus. There was no summary pages in a prospectus. You had to read the whole damn thing to get what you wanted. So I said, well, so why don't we write 3 pages that will tell the whole story? And
What a concept.
yeah, what a crazy idea. But the SEC wouldn't permit it. So Eli called it the Mother Goose section of the prospectus. And we actually persuaded Sullivan and Cromwell to go down and argue with the SEC to include this summary. And in some ways, I mean, it's a little bit indicative of the stuff that has turned me on all my life. I mean, he was absolutely right. I mean, it was a terribly boring idea, but if you sit down for 5 minutes and think about something like that, there's a way to, make a difference. So
you started with your $20 million deal, and you spent a decade and a half, right?
Mm-hmm.
There. Tell us about the arc of how your kind of role evolved and what you found most interesting and challenging during that time before you decided to leave.
Yeah, well, it probably goes deal by deal. I mean,
let's talk about a couple of them that really stand out.
well, let me do 3. A very early on, I was fascinated by entrepreneurship and company creation and blah, blah, blah. Through a series of connections that weren't mine, an entrepreneur walked in and he had an idea to start a company that would, using a whole lot of pretty advanced software, attack the question of inventory shrinkage in supermarkets. And so I went into Paul Miller's office and I said, look, this is a pretty good idea. We could put in $100K, and if it worked, it might be a really, huge thing. And there was no venture capital. I mean, imagine 1964. I mean, Benno Schmidt invented the word for venture capital, I think, in 1972. So he said, do it. And I said, but, let's have an understanding. I think I was maybe 3 or 4 years into the firm. When it comes to the end of the year, there won't be any revenues next to my name. And so I'd like to have sort of a handshake at least that, I'll get paid. Sure enough, comes the end of the year, I have the meeting with the guy who was heading the department. He said, Jack, your bonus is down 50% because you have no revenues next to your name. That was a wake-up call. That was a good thing. And I wasn't about to go back into the president's office and say, hey, did you tell anybody about this? It eventually failed, and it was a great lesson because it was a good idea, but it was, for a whole bunch of reasons, unexecutable. So that was a funny kind of off-the-charts thing. The next one I would say is 1975. I got fascinated with Japan, and a long story footnote is that my father's brother was a partner of Dillon Reed, and that was then an investment bank that looked very much like Morgan Stanley. It's obviously long gone now. And Dillon Reed, because of the Dillon family, had a lot of Japanese connections. And Ted Wadsworth was his name, had done some of the early work in Japan after the war. And so I was curious, I was fascinated, and there were really, oddly enough, 3 investment banks that shared Japan as a client. Kuhn Loeb, Dillon Reed, and First Boston. Morgan Stanley's a whole other story. There's a reason why they were not on the list that had something to do with one of the partners' sons dying in the war or something. Anyway, the assignment in 1975 was to reintroduce the Japanese credit into the world markets and to get Japan rated as a sovereign credit. There was one country rated then, it was Australia. No other country had ratings. So at the age of, I guess, about 30, I was sent to Japan as the head of the team to do a $150 million bond issue for Japan. Actually, Japan Development Bank, guaranteed by the government, and to get the country rated. So I went to Japan for a month. And my first meeting with the Vice Minister of Finance, Tario Yoshida, you still see his face, about that tall. He said, Mr. Wadsworth, we are going to shut down all of the financing of the Japanese government until you get us a bond rating. And he said there's only one acceptable rating, and that has 3 A's in it.
Surprise, surprise.
Right.
No pressure.
Oh. So we got a AAA, and I still have the book that we produced celebrating that fact. And, I've telexes in those days from the Vice Minister of Finance thanking
Huge.
First Boston for...
Huge.
Yeah. I mean, it was one of those amazing experiences. The next deal I would mention is the IPO for Amdahl Computer. Because of that Japan connection, Paul Miller said, Jack, would you be the head of Japan? And the head of Japan for First Boston in 1976 was one person, a chauffeur, and I think maybe a dog, and a small office and a secretary. So I said, sure, I'll do that. But then I went to what did it mean? It meant that I went to Japan twice a year to call on clients. Because Japan in those days, when it had a positive balance of payments, you could do private placements in Japan with Japanese institutions. When the balance of payments was negative, they would raise money in the euro market. And the euro bond market was a big thing then. I mean, it had been just invented, and so it was a one-way business. And so you had to have a very flexible view of how to staff it. And you also had 3 or 4 deals a year, which were maybe a big one was 50 million. So I would call on Fujitsu, and Fujitsu was the main shareholder and backer of Amdahl. And a venture capitalist, who was legendary in those days, named Ned Heiser in Chicago. Heiser owned about, 30% of Amdahl. Fujitsu owned about 40%, and the rest was owned by Gene Amdahl and the management. And they decided to go public. And I went to see them in Sunnyvale. And Gene White was the CEO. Gene Amdahl was sort of the scientific genius. And he said, and they had a prospectus that had Merrill Lynch on the front. It was already ready to be filed. He said, we don't like these Merrill Lynch guys, and we know that you know Japan, and we want First Boston to do the deal. They had not sold a computer yet. I mean, it was the first IBM compatible 360, and it was a really complicated subject. They had a couple of orders from AT&T, but they hadn't delivered them. And so I said to Gene White, in some ways I sort of wish I hadn't come to see you, because this is really a hard question. And First Boston is a very conservative firm, and we don't have a lot of history of understanding technology or doing IPOs. So let me just say that if we were to say yes to do this deal, it would probably take 6 months. And he said, okay, you got 6 months. I thought, oh my Lord. Now what do I do?
So out went Merrill Lynch and...
Yeah. So I put together a due diligence team. I went right back to New York and said, we need lawyers, technology advisors, somebody look at the computer. I went right in to see the chairman of the firm, who was then a guy named George Shin. He's passed away, so I can say he is one of the main reasons I left First Boston. He was a real idiot. He had come from Merrill Lynch, and he run branch offices at Merrill Lynch. He didn't know much about investment banking. And so we had this big meeting in the boardroom where each member of the team reported. And another thing I would have to say, I had to pick somebody to work with me on this assignment, and there were a bunch of different choices, but the person I thought who was smart enough to get it, but who was risk-oriented enough to actually go through the process was a guy named George Needham. And today there still is a famous little boutique investment bank named Needham & Company, and that's George Needham. And it was the Amdahl deal that made him. Anyway, 2 hours of presentations, and I'm sitting at the head of the table with George Shin. And the question was posed, okay, so what do we do? George Shin turned to me and said, Jack, do we have to decide today? I mean, how do you get through a moment like that? I said, yes!
After all this.
Let's have a show of hands. So we did it.
You did it?
And he left the room.
Was it hard to push through?
Oh, well, then, I mean, doing the deal
Yeah.
was really hard because the prospectus, said when we priced the deal, they had still not sold a computer.
So what was the pricing? What did you end up? How did you just?
Do you remember? It's one of those things that I mean, it was a relatively, I think it was a $150 million deal. It was relatively small, maybe a market cap of $500 million. I mean, in those days, that was a big deal, and but obviously the rest is history. It became hugely successful, and it eventually charted the way for IBM compatible computing. But in fact, it was hard.
So on the prospectus, thinking about that, hadn't sold a unit, not a lot of market demand from people who were trying to figure out what they were going to do with it, untested. So what was the story that you were telling in the prospectus that made it successful?
Well, the prospectus didn't give you any reason to buy it. I mean, it was, in those days, the roadshow and
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
As you went around, what was the story? This is
just a big idea, a huge idea, and as you might imagine, the buyers were institutions who were sophisticated. The trading market was thin. I mean, I can't even remember if it went up or down after we priced it, but it didn't do much for a couple of years, and then they started selling equipment, and it was a great success. But no, I mean, the pitch was just simply, here is the big idea, and IBM compatible equipment has got a huge future, and we don't know exactly who it'll be, and the bet was, I mean, it was never said, maybe by me, but the bet was that Fujitsu is going to make this work. I mean, Ned Heiser was tapped out, and the management was good, but Fujitsu had to make it work.
So this is a recurring theme where you recognize early on, maybe earlier than anybody else, because the evidence isn't clear yet, what the next big thing might be. Mm-hmm. What gave you the confidence to sort of bet on Amdahl of all things? I mean, was it instinct? Was it How do you account for you sort of recognizing this big new vision?
Well, I mean, I think the next big things come in two forms. I mean, one is the idea. And, I guess to me it was just an obvious idea. I mean, one of the reasons that Gene Amdahl left IBM was because they were suppressing technology. I mean, he said it outright, he lived it, he believed it, and then he acted on it. And suppressing technology is a bad thing. And, he proved it. So that was, I mean, if you were kind of inside thinking about it and then also aware of what Fujitsu was doing in Japan, it wasn't hard to put these two things together. And I mean, the CEO of Fujitsu, when I first met him, he didn't speak much English, but enough to say, Mr. Wadsworth, you know I am a former kamikaze pilot.
That's all you needed to know.
And I had to say, how does that work? He said the war ended.
He outlived it.
Yeah, right. I mean, but that's the kind of person that Japan is not full of many risk takers. But I mean, here was a guy who just out of the box. I said, wow, this guy's going to make it happen. He really has guts. And then the other part of the equation is people. I mean, people count for me for everything in the end. The best ideas in the world are no good without people to execute them. And Gene Amdahl was a dreamer and a flake and a brilliant scientist, but Gene White was the CEO. He was the visionary. And I'll never forget, I was trying to sort of get the launch of this deal right. And he said to me one day, he said, Jack, this is like a gigantic jetliner. I mean, it was a DC-8 or something in those days. And he said, we're 3/4 of the way down the runway, and the wheels are off the ground. We have to go.
It's a great story.
I said, okay, let's do it.
So you did it.
Yeah.
In hindsight, as you look back, it's been, 40 years. We can point to a lot of things that was really an important moment, a juncture, right?
Yeah.
So for those who aren't familiar, can you just kind of underscore, what was the significance of that deal and it sort of ushered in a new era? Can you just summarize your perspective on that, its impact, sort of historical?
Well, I mean, hindsight, it was brilliant science, and brilliant science is okay, but it needs a purpose, and it needs to be commercialized if you care. And so those two things went together. I think at that moment in history, it had the curious additional dimension of bringing in Japan. And Japan was so far ahead in those days in many respects. I mean, those were the days of, books about Japan taking over the world.
Japan Inc., right?
MIT introducing, manufacturing courses so we could stay up with them, blah, blah, blah. Of course, it was, by then, it was a wealthy country. And the other thing that fascinated me, not many people would know Ned Heiser, but Ned Heiser was, I would say he was the prototype of today's venture capitalist in a way.
Say more.
Yeah, he was given a mandate at Allstate Insurance to invest in early stage companies that were private. And he was a very smart guy and a very gutsy guy, and he just blew the cover off in that portfolio and became famous. I mean, everybody in the country then was sort of saying, wow, this is maybe a new thing. You can actually make money investing in these private early stage technology companies. And then he took that track record and created Heiser and Company. So it was, in some ways, the first venture capital firm, and I had read all that stuff, and I was fascinated by just the idea and his success. And so, I mean, that was sort of the reason I got stuck. I mean, Fujitsu was interesting, but I think they said to me 3 times, please go call on Amdahl. And I ignored the first 2. I said, this looks too hard. So all of that sort of stuff came together. And if you think about today, or the early days of, of the great firms, the Venrocks, the Kleiner Perkinses, there were, well, it's a whole nother story, but I think the other thing that sort of intrigues me now, even as I look back on it, there were a dozen venture firms that were at the top of the pyramid. And, today, 40 years later, it's still almost the same top of the pyramid. I mean, there have been some disruptors, but so all that kind of fit together. And I think it was, certainly for George Needham, I mean, it was a harbinger of things to come.
Sure.
He took that and went off and created a tech boutique investment banking firm.
And for you, it wasn't too long after that you made a switch.
Right.
So talk about that decision. You mentioned a little bit of your reasoning, but why that time and why Morgan Stanley and why that new role that you had with Morgan Stanley?
Well, let's see. It was the winter of 1978, and there were a handful of us who were the management committee of First Boston, and probably my closest partner in crime was a guy named Al Shoemaker. And Al and I wrote a paper that, just to step back, when I was made a managing director of First Boston, I got the title and I got a stock option. And the stock option was for 2,000 shares at 20. And I went home that night just elated. I mean, it was one of those, God, the guy from Fort Thomas, Kentucky, I really made it, Yeah. And Susie said, 2,000 shares at 20, that's not much money. I said, my God, I hadn't even noticed that. Oh, she's been so important at just the right moment. So, I was okay, that's right. And so Al Shoemaker and I wrote this paper in 1977, and it basically said, First Boston is graduating the firms of the future. I mean, people are leaving and they're going to, you could create a whole firm with the people who'd left in those sort of 4 or 5 years. And so the paper said, if you want to ensure the future of this enterprise tomorrow, transfer 20% of the equity over to the producers. The time has come. You either do it or you don't do it. And we went in to see George Shin, and he had read the paper, and he said, this is very interesting, into the round file. Shoemaker left the next day.
Yeah,
He left the next day.
Why would you stay?
Yeah.
Right.
And I thought, geez, I really love this place. I'm really happy at what I'm doing. And we're going to have to figure this out, but, I'm going to stick around. I'll make it work. 3 months later, again, a monstrously long story, but the whole London office of First Boston left and went to Blythe, which was where Al Shoemaker went. That's another story. And by sheer coincidence, Merrill Lynch was in the process of buying White Weld. And White Weld had this marvelous little machine in London called Credit Suisse White Weld. And when I did the research to back up my recommendation to do the joint venture investment bank in China, I looked at every joint venture that had ever been created in the financial world, and there were two that were successful: Credit Suisse White Weld and Jardine Fleming. There weren't three, there were two.
There were two.
And there's a simple reason. One partner had the clients and the other partner had the money. So White Weld, was a great old sort of white shoe firm then. But the guys at Credit Suisse White Weld in London refused to go to Merrill Lynch. So here's George Shin, kind of in the catbird seat. Our London office has just left, and Merrill Lynch has offered Credit Suisse White Weld. And he put me on the deal. And after a week, I met Rainer Gut, who was then the CEO of Credit Suisse. The caricature of a Swiss banker, right? He was so belligerent and so mean and so Swiss. You say American investment banking, and he said, "What's that?" So I went home that night and I said to Susie, we have three choices. I've just met the man. We can suffer like hell for 25 years because that's my horizon in this business. I don't want to do anything else, but it's going to be really, really miserable. We can go back to Kentucky,
Really?
or I can dial one phone number. She said, "What's the number?" So I called Morgan Stanley, and that's a long story. There's a guy named Bill Black who was one of the very senior partners, and his father was the first president of the World Bank. He was just a really interesting gentleman. And I called him up and said, "Can I come over and see you Saturday morning?" And one of the things that I have always done, I don't do it anymore, but I kept my resume up to date every single year. Really? I mean, I've always, in fact, I've advised anybody who works for me, if you don't know your market, nobody will. So that's your responsibility. And, you can make some good choices and some bad choices, but you better know what you're worth. There's no other way to get through life. So anyway, I gave him my resume and I said, "Bill, you will read some stuff in the paper the next 2 or 3 months that will indicate why I'm thinking about leaving First Boston. And there's only one firm in the street that has the same culture, and that's really important to me. And it's Morgan Stanley. And so if you guys would be interested, I would entertain an offer." He said, "Jack, we have 48 partners, and you'd have to meet every one. We've never taken a partner in laterally from Wall Street. So, I know you, a bunch of people know you. I had, fortunately, I for some reason in those days I would compete with Morgan Stanley more than Goldman Sachs or Solomon, and I almost always won, and so I was an item."
You were known.
I was known. And so I said, "Bill, I've got one partner, and we decide things very quickly. And if that's your answer, give me my resume back." And this conversation never took place. And if I hear you ever told anybody that it did, I'll deny it. So he handed it back. The Credit Suisse deal was announced in June, and Paul Miller, my mentor, retired that summer. And on Thursday, September 1st, I got a call from Bill Black, and he said, "Could you come over to my house in Brooklyn Heights? I have something to talk to you about." He had an offer. And it was a meager percentage of the enterprise. Turned out to be just fine, because meager percentages of Morgan Stanley in those days became worth a lot of money. I said that's a pretty puny percentage, but I'll call you tomorrow morning. And so I accepted. And that was Friday. And on Monday I left. And never looked back. It was hard. It was hard.
I was going to say it was
really hard. I had
hard decision, right?
Yeah.
You were leaving behind a lot of things.
Yeah. And yeah, there's still, Joe Perella, was head of M&A at First Boston, and he and I were joined at the hip on just a lot of stuff. And there was a long time that he didn't forgive me. He just, Jack. And I got him to join Morgan Stanley. That took a while.
So you became a Morgan Stanley man.
Yep.
And what did that mean for you culturally to change? And you were very quick to dismiss. You didn't want to go to Goldman. And what did that represent to you? And in fact, how did you adjust to that transition to become, to move to Morgan Stanley?
I suppose it was a lot of hunches based on people I knew and the way I'd seen them compete. Integrity, hard work, viciously competitive in a way, but a nice sort of competitive mode. In hindsight, a lot of things were confirmed. One of the things that I used a lot in Asia was one of Mr. Morgan's famous quotes, where in testimony before the Senate in 1935, everybody remembers first-class business in a first-class way, which is, that's fine, but it's a trite sort of Morgan Stanley thing that has the risk of being a little bit arrogant. But the important thing he said was, and the Senate was trying to write legislation which in their mind would have ensured the preservation of reputation. They actually talked about it. One of the problems with the recession, depression problem is that, it's not a new idea, that, Wall Street, didn't care enough about their reputation to behave properly. And so Mr. Morgan said, seeing the future with clarity is difficult. So when planning for the future, we have all made mistakes. But if I may speak for the firm that I'm proud to be the senior partner of, unlike many of our competitors, our mistakes have been mistakes of judgment, not principle. That resonates.
That's powerful.
And I use it to teach. The flip side of that is if you're, in a risky business, you can't bat 100% on judgment or you'll never make a decision. So don't confuse that with principle where you must bat 100%. 99 doesn't work. We see it every day. And that sort of permeates the way the firm thinks. I honestly believe we would never have gotten into the soup that Goldman Sachs is in Malaysia. That's so stupid. You just don't have people like that in the firm. You fire them before they get in trouble because they're going to do something terrible. One bad egg is one bad egg, and that's all it takes. So anyway, I love that sort of part of the firm, and every time we've done something big, the Dean Witter merger going public, there's always the business meeting, and then there's an hour devoted to can we maintain the culture if we do this. And I go back to Morgan Stanley today in New York, and I spend time with James Gorman and the guys who are running the firm. many of whom I'm very proud to say I hired in Hong Kong.
You brought them in. You've created a succession plan.
Right. And there's a spirit of collegiality and cooperation and excitement that, that to me is what it's about. First Boston had it in the days that I was there. I mean, one of the things that First Boston in the league tables in the 60s was number one in everything. And league tables even counted in those days. And when First Boston started to become number 2 and number 3, that was another problem. The leadership didn't know how to talk about it. It's easy to, say we're number 1 in everything, and then all of a sudden you're number 2 and number 3, and you got to develop a different pitch.
Avis, right? We try harder. So, can you say a word about that leadership of culture and principle? It's especially as companies grow and you have new people that join the firm. It's not automatic to have a continuity of strong culture and values. You were really important in recruiting new people that would go on to be leaders. What's your view on leadership that is not just about personal success, but leading a whole and creating a whole institution?
Well, leadership, it's critically important, and it's like entrepreneurship. Everybody sort of knows what it means, but you can't define it, you can't teach it, you just have to be it. And I think leadership is painfully simple to me, because it's about one person. It's the head of the firm. And everything emanates from the way that person comports themselves, I mean, if you're the head of Enron and you're stealing, guess what? Everybody else is going to steal, right? So you have to be impeccably honest. You have to, be intellectually honest. You have to admit you have to do all those things. I mean, we had one leader at Morgan Stanley who, even though he was the CEO, I mean, in those days you weren't that, you were the managing partner, he couldn't resist the temptation to claim credit for a deal. And that's really not leadership. It's bad. But it, I mean, there was that period of time where it sort of permeated down the organization. So it's about giving people credit, maybe making people feel good. It's about all those qualities of behavior that lead to the kind of behavior that you want to emulate throughout the organization, but it starts at the top. I mean, one of my really good clients and good friends in Singapore once said to me, he said, I will always ask Goldman Sachs for a proposal when I ask Morgan Stanley for a proposal, because they always think of something that I wouldn't have thought of. But he said, I will probably always hire Morgan Stanley because when your team comes in, it feels to me like they like each other. And the Goldman Sachs team doesn't. I don't know. It's but it's at the top. It's just plain at the top.
All right, so we're just to Morgan Stanley, and you've joined in 1978. Is that right? Mm-hmm. We've talked about your transition. If we could do the same thing, so talk about here, unlike at First Boston, you were coming in at a senior level and helping define a whole area of work. Can you talk about your vision in your new role, where you were headed, and some of the early deals?
Yeah, I have to step back a bit on the start at Morgan Stanley. When I was invited to join the firm as a partner, the first one from the street, from the outside.
A pioneer.
I had no job description. I was not hired to do a job. I was hired as a partner of Morgan Stanley to do something that was yet to be defined. And I liked that. It was a little uncomfortable. In fact, I had never met the then CEO, senior partner of Morgan Stanley, Bob Baldwin, except in a social setting. So my first day at the firm, I went into his office to be interviewed. And it was one of those absolutely marvelous experiences where, I mean, he was one of the people who couldn't resist the temptation to take credit for good things. And so he talked to me about his view of the firm, and there were a couple things that I remember he said that resonated. One, he said, Jack, you have to feel like I feel someday, and that is when I get off the elevator every morning to come to my desk, I feel like my feet don't touch the ground. I said, okay, I'll work on that. And then he said, there was a guy named Alec Tomlinson who, one of the things that Bob did that created the Morgan Stanley of today, he had a vision for a diversified firm that would incorporate distribution and trading and research alongside of the traditional investment banking. And to do that, he had to break a lot of eggs. And the first set of eggs that he had to break was to reorder the lockstep partner percentages that everybody, owned in the firm. And so one day he announced a big change of ownership, with an inner circle approving it, but pretty unilateral. And a whole bunch of partners who were not pulling their weight left. And that's exactly what he wanted to happen. And one of them was a guy named Alec Tomlinson, who, another reason on my first Boston list of things, he became, we hired him, and he became head of the investment banking department, which is sort of more or less what I was doing. And so Baldwin said, so what do you think of Alec Tomlinson? And I said, well, it was a little disappointing that he didn't take charge of the investment banking department and develop a vision and a strategy that was needed, for the moment. And but he was a great investment banker. I mean, he really was good at doing deals. And Baldwin said, if you'd known him a little bit longer, you would have known he wasn't very good at doing deals either. So anyway, that was my sort of encounter with the leadership. And my next stop was the head of investment banking at Morgan Stanley, is a guy named Louis Bernard. And he said, so Jack, what do you want to do? And he didn't tell me what he thought I should do. He asked me. And I had given a fair amount of thought to it. And, I think what he was sort of prepared for was for me to say, well, I'd like to cover DuPont and General Motors and U.S. Steel and, give me some good clients. And instead I said, Louis, you must have 3 or 4 transactions that are in deep trouble and 10 clients that nobody wants to call on. Why don't you give me those?
What?
And it's just one of those things that you think about a little bit, and it was the best thing I possibly could have done. And it wasn't, a scheme. It wasn't thought out. It just sort of felt right. And it's the way I've done a lot of things. So, and I would say the other thing on my mind is that I was being, I wouldn't say groomed, but I was in the process of sort of being persuaded by some of the leadership at First Boston, to run for president. And I'm not the kind of person that runs for office, first of all. I mean, it's always been something that I abhorred. And secondly, my love was doing deals. It was not management. So, another sort of subtext for Morgan Stanley was that I knew, my peers at Morgan Stanley were running the firm. I knew them all. Dick Fisher and Bob Greenhill. The last thing I wanted to do was, or could do, they were really good at what they were doing, and they were, they had Morgan Stanley blood in their veins, and so it was not an alternative to just going back into going back into the kitchen doing deals. So that's, for the first 5 years, that's what I did, basically. I just got to know the firm, worked on transactions. They gave me an office between Parker Gilbert and Don McAllister, who were, Parker eventually became chairman of the firm. And, it was so obvious, it was painful that these guys are going to take care of Jack. And be sure he doesn't do anything really stupid. Then the interesting stuff started. I was eventually on the sort of operating committee of investment banking, and one of those famous days, Greenhill says, we need a private equity fund. Everybody's doing it. We got to have one. Jack, why don't you do it? So I did that. Actually, very early in the process, there was a conversation about starting a business development department. Morgan Stanley was this marvelous place that answered phones. We never solicited business. And so the idea was to pick some companies that we wouldn't ordinarily call on, and then pick some emerging companies. And the short list of emerging companies included Apple Computer. And the only reason it included Apple Computer is that the computer analyst at Morgan Stanley, whose name was Ben Rosen, had an Apple II on his desk. And he called us up and showed us, what it was. And he said, this is a big deal. This is going to be important. Somebody should go out and call on Apple and see what their plans are. So those two things, obviously, the whole private equity fundraising activity was, it's almost a book. I put together a business plan, got all the legal documents done, and it basically said we'd like to raise $500 million of senior debt, $500 million of mezzanine debt, and $250 million of equity, and we've never managed a fund before, so trust us. And I got turned down 87 times.
87 times.
That's how many meetings I had. And somewhere in the middle of that 87 meetings, I had a meeting with Cigna, who was trying to raise a mezzanine fund. And so the end game was we partnered with them, and we put up $75 million of equity. They put up a mezzanine fund and some senior debt. And we put a guy named Don Brennan in charge of running it. He joined us from International Paper. He was the only guy in the firm who had ever had any operating experience. So not surprisingly, the first fund had a lot of paper companies and forest products companies in it. And it had one chemical company in it that we put, $10 million into, and it became a $1 billion investment. I would say, smart, but pretty much blind luck. And that was then the basis for Fund 2, which we did without Cigna.
What was the time horizon on that first? What was the time horizon on that first?
3 years.
Not bad.
No. The next fund was $500 million of regular private equity stuff, no fancy debt components. And we raised 100% of that in Japan, which is another whole story. It was one of those years where Japan was bulging with extra money, and they all seemed to think that private equity was something they wanted to do. And because of what we'd been doing there, we had a lot of relationships. And then the Apple story. I don't know. Maybe you want to sort of sidetrack my. direction here.
Well, before we get to the Apple Store, I want to go a little bit a little deeper into the PE fund, because this really was something new and different and exceptionally successful, but it wasn't obvious that that was going to be the case 3 to 5 years later. Can you talk about some of the challenges as you were shaping the strategy and trying to kind of get it running, and then fast forward and then to when you were looking at what it really paved the way for, everything that followed?
Well, I think the first thing is that there were some interesting business models out there to look at. KKR was even then kind of the forerunner of private equity, as it became, and there was Gibbons Green, and there was Laird, and there were just a few firms, but there was no Goldman Sachs we were kind of the first out of the box, and I would say the key to the success of the early funds was the fact that we just developed a business model that embraced the idea that you could leverage low-risk businesses that were growing at 3% with 80% debt and create the return by paying down the debt. I mean, nobody had ever thought of that. And I remember saying that there are two kinds of risks that make money. One is financial risk, and the other is business risk. And venture capital is pure business risk, and real private equity is financial risk. If you pick the right companies, which Donald Brennan was able to do, we had Burlington Industries and James Paper, and I mean, it was really rust bucket, basic businesses that were pretty well managed and grew at almost guaranteed, 3% rates of return with positive cash flows that enabled you to pay the debt down. And I would say those early 2 or 3 funds kind of put the capital on the books that made Morgan Stanley what it was. I mean, before we went public in 1986, our equity capital was $300 million. And, by the end of that decade, it was about $3 billion.
Yeah, order of magnitude.
Yeah, and a lot of it came from private equity. I remember the going public meeting in 1986. We thought we needed $1 billion to become a global firm. And that was fundamentally the strategy. In fact, the number was probably more like $5 billion. And I dare say if we'd known that it was 5 and not 1, we probably would have sold the firm, because there were 50 of us in the room and there was nobody over the age of 51. And the reason to go public is that nobody had the money to put up to get there. So that private equity strategy was really important, and the money raising side of it was where I continued to be active. I was on the investment committee, but I didn't try and argue with Brennan. He was a very smart, directed guy, and I would say Parker Gilbert was the chairman during that period of time, and probably the most important thing that Parker did, aside from getting us public, which really was his doing, was to say no to Donald Brennan about 4 times, deals that would not make sense. And one of the things that was absolutely critical as a part of the strategy is that the way you did a deal was to do equity and then bridge loans, and then fund the bridge loans. And as we evolved that strategy, we had one cardinal rule, and that was that we would never put a bridge loan to a private equity deal that we did on our own balance sheet unless we owned 51% of the equity. 49%, no deal. And the burning mattress that sunk First Boston, they didn't control the equity. Yeah, and they got hung. It busted the firm.
How was that decision made?
What?
How was that decision made, the 51%?
A small group of people in a room that said, if we don't control the company, we don't control the bridge loan funding. Period. I mean, it's just that simple. There's a level of risk that's worth taking and a level of risk that's not worth taking. So I continued to be involved in the sort of fundraising, and that was one of the reasons why the next fund that we did was Japan. And that was fine. It was a mistake in the following sense, that the next Fund 3, Japan was out of money, as Japan always sort of goes in cycles. So we had to create a whole new list of limited partners. So we had to get into the pension fund, college endowment world, which didn't know us. So it was like starting over. Meanwhile, I continued to do deals because that was still my main thing.
So that's a perfect segue into some of, and there are so many deals we could talk about.
Yeah.
Where should we start?
Well, the Apple deal was what got it. I mean, it's what really started the high-tech banking. I mean, I again, proposed that this was an area of opportunity that we should, begin to pursue. And it was, I guess, in 1979, 1980, the entire high-tech banking wallet, might have been $100 million a year. I mean, there were really no deals. There were no companies. I mean, Fairchild, Intel, I mean, they were not big investment banking opportunities. And if you looked at the competition, I mean, it was the four horsemen. It was H&Q and Montgomery and Sandy Robertson and Alex Brown. I mean, that was it. And they were tiny firms. And even in, well, always, but even accentuated in the early days was the tech banking cycle and the IPO cycle. And I mean, Bill Hambrecht is, quick to tell the story about the number of down cycles where he had to mortgage his house to keep the firm afloat. So it wasn't, wasn't an obvious, new business category to throw a lot of resources at, but it looked promising. And, I think at that time you could see that the computing industry was going to change and that Moore's Law was going to drive economics in a really big way. And the personal computer was going to be a monstrous factor. And so, at the front end of the high tech banking strategy was Apple. I mean, at the time, was not obvious at all that was going to be the case at all. No, yeah. No.
So talk about your first interactions with the firm. Who, when, where? When did you first meet these Apple characters?
Yeah. So we went out to Cupertino to call on Apple, and the only person who came into the room was Steve. To this day, I have never met Steve Wozniak. I mean, it's curious.
Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, he comes here often to the museum.
Yeah, I almost feel like I know him, but from the moment that they started talking about being a public company, Steve Wozniak sort of left the room. I mean, I would say he retired before they went public. I mean, he was not an officer of the firm. He was a shareholder. But he's just not around. So it was Mike Scott, who was then the CEO, and Steve was whatever he called himself. But that first meeting, I mean, it's so everything you've ever written about Jobs is true. I mean, he walked into the meeting with his black T-shirt, Levi's, and sandals, and put his feet up on the table and said, "So, what's your name?" "Jack." "Yeah, Wadsworth. What does Morgan Stanley do?" I mean, it's almost like interviewing at the University of Chicago. And so I said politely, and then he said, "So, how many IPOs have you done?" I said, "Well, you should know that I've recently joined the firm, and I did do Amdahl, so I know something about tech IPOs, but Morgan Stanley did Kodak in 1939, Texas Instruments in 1957, and Marsh McLennan in 1962, and we haven't done one since." And he said, "Well, those are good names." Excuse me. And so being a little bit put off by his behavior, I then said to him, "So when did you think you had a company?" And he literally said, "Jack, do you remember when they invented the wheel?"
That was his reply?
That was his answer. He said, "The personal computer will be that important." And he was right. He was right. And one of the things that I actually learned a lot about from the Apple experience is that business models, and it's not just technology, but particularly technology business models that make human beings more efficient, more productive, have a sustainability that business models that are, say, based on fashion or whim or trends or something don't have. And you can see it everywhere. And so I've always worried about companies that didn't, have that sort of value added, to society to actually really become something important. The next part of the story was we got to business, and they said to us, Steve said to us, "So, we've been working with Hambrecht Quist, and they're a big shareholder, and you can have them as a co-manager or not, up to you." And those were the days when Morgan Stanley dropped out of business if we had a co-manager. In fact, there's a famous moment. I was into the firm about a year, and a partners meeting was called for the purpose of voting on whether or not we would be a co-manager with Salomon Brothers on a $1 billion IBM bond issue. And we turned it down. I thought to myself, no, wait a minute. I spent 15 years at First Boston trying to get a piece of any one of these deals, and we just turned it down.
$1 billion deal.
And of course, it was not irrational. It was thoughtful, and it was thoughtful to the extent that we actually had done all the numbers. If we accepted that co-managership, we would then have all these companies who we had persuaded to keep us as sole manager to deal with. And so if we could win one more argument, it made sense. The fact that we lost the argument meant that, it was just okay. It's a new world. It's a new deal. So that was still the mindset at Morgan Stanley. So I went back to New York and I said, look, we can have H&Q or not. It's up to us. But I recommend that we put H&Q on the cover of the prospectus because we have no brand in tech banking. Nobody knows who Morgan Stanley is. And if we make them the enemy, guess what? It's not just about getting business because of that relationship. It'll be that we're frozen out of a lot of stuff because they will resent the fact that, and you know, Apple will tell them that it was our choice, right? That won't go unnoticed. And so we had a partners meeting, and we voted to accept Hambrecht Quist with Apple, but we wouldn't accept Solomon with IBM for $1 billion. So that was an important moment. And I always say the other thing that was important to me in that relationship was that at the closing, H&Q took home $25 million, and we took home $2.5 million. And I went back to New York again and said, there's something wrong with these numbers. I think we got to start a venture capital business because we're missing. If we're going to be serious about tech banking, we got to get on the front end and, you know, benefit from the stuff that we're going to help create. So that was, again, a sort of seminal moment, and that did lead to our eventually getting into the venture capital business. But the Apple IPO itself was, I mean, it's in those photographs in the closing dinner. I mean, it was just event after event after event, and you know, I had to buy Steve a suit. He didn't have a suit. So I had to buy him some shoes so he would look decent, you know, at the roadshow. And
talk about the roadshow, if you could just tell the story a little more detail.
It was a roadshow like every other roadshow. I mean, it was a good story, and Steve and Mike Scott, you know, presented. Steve sort of about the big picture, and Mike Scott about the numbers and the future. And it was out of the box, you know, 10 times oversubscribed. I mean, the roadshow was kind of show and tell for the sake of it, because it was a hot deal. And I would say the biggest problem that resulted from that was allocating the shares, you know, and people have gone to jail over that. And this again was Uncle Jack saying, you know, nobody gets any shares in this deal unless they've had an account at Morgan Stanley for at least a year and have over $1 million net worth. In fact, I remember some Harvard Business School student got through to me on the telephone and said he wanted to open an account at Morgan Stanley to get Apple shares. And I said, well, you know, it takes $1 million to open the account. And before I said anything else, he said, I'll call you back next year.
Only 1 year.
Right. But there was a moment in the roadshow that two that I remember. One, we were doing the usual Swiss bank thing in Zurich, and I would start the introduction by saying that our objective is to allocate shares to long-term investors. And some Swiss bank guy in the back of the room shouted out, Mr. Wadsworth, if you want to have long-term investors, just be sure that the first trade is down 20%. True story. And of course, you know, he's right. I mean, one of the problems with the IPO process is that you get a lot of flippers in who, you know, it goes up and they sell. And of course, this is a whole other story, is Bill Hambrecht's auction ideas for doing IPOs. The other just kind of funny event, Steve forgot to pick up his laundry in Cork, Ireland, and he ordered the Morgan Stanley associate, who was a Baker scholar, to go back and get his laundry. And after the deal was over, she quit. And I'm sure that had something to do with it. If this is the way I'm going to be treated, it's not a good thing. But no, I mean, it was a lot of fun and a lot of camaraderie. You know, one of the other memorable features of that experience was George Quist. George Quist was the H&Q partner who was on the deal, and he and one of the reasons H&Q in those days was such a powerhouse is that he and Bill are just polar opposites. I mean, George was the captain of the Stanford football team. He was an all-American guy. He was, plenty smart, but he was just a good old boy, and everybody liked him. And Bill was the tech guy. He was the brains.
So we've made it through the road show, and now it's time, the day. What do you remember about the day of the IPO, before the celebration?
Well,
pricing, early signals.
The pricing conversations was about $22 or $21, so it wasn't that big a deal. The book was huge, so it really enabled the pricing to be anywhere you want it. There was really no argument in the price.
Did you feel like did people argue that you left some on the table? It was too low?
Not in those days. I mean, one of the great ironies was every IPO has to be cleared by state blue sky commissioners, right? So to confirm orders in every state, you have to have the blue sky commissioner's approval. And the blue sky commissioner in Massachusetts denied the transaction for Massachusetts investors because he thought it was going to be overpriced and that all the investors would lose money in Massachusetts. One of these slides is a Apple Computer stock certificate that has written across it, banned in Boston. And of course what happened is that the first trade was 28 after we priced it at 21. The stock traded between 12 and 30 the next 12 months. I mean, it was a typical, I think, new company. I mean,
very volatile.
Yeah. The revenue forecast they delivered, and the P&L they delivered, but the stock traded between 30 and 12. And the great irony of the Massachusetts story is that the hue and cry in Boston was all over the front page of the newspapers, and I mean, not protests in the street, but a lot of sort of guffaw and concern about why they'd been precluded from participating. And so the following Thursday changed his mind and let everybody buy at 28. So they actually did lose money.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, right.
So where, place me, where were you as you were watching the prices, and then that night or the celebration, kind of, who are you with, and where are you? And
as the case of most deals, this was a big conference call, and I was in New York, and we priced it, and then you wait till the next morning to become effective, and trading starts, and these days, NASDAQ, and it was not a big deal for me at that point to sort of be there or be anywhere. So we were, again, sort of on the telephone when the first trade started, and everybody was happy. I mean, it was like, yeah, we still own the company, so 28 sounds good.
Sounds really good.
That's always been my argument. I mean, Morgan Stanley went public in 1986 at $35 a share, and the first trade was like 45. And we were severely criticized for mispricing our own stock. And we still owned 80% of the firm. It's like, come on, you guys don't get it.
So celebrating, a lot to celebrate, and thank you so much for bringing those photos. We'll take a close look and, with your permission, digitize those.
I mean, each picture is a story.
Yeah.
And so it's.
What was the mood? You know, who
Oh,
was
the mood was celebration, extraordinary. I mean, great humor. I mean, one of the incidents was Mike Scott opened the chauffeur door in front of the Chicago club to go in for the pitch, and a taxi cab driver came by and knocked the door down the street.
Oh, really?
You know, I mean, another second and we'd been minus a president. So one of the kids went to the junkyard and got a door and brought it to the closing dinner. An old car door. There was a guy named Finley who owned the Oakland A's, who was desperate to get an allocation in the offering. And the reason people were wearing A's baseball hats was because of Charlie Finley. And in the middle of the filing period, he filed a lawsuit against Morgan Stanley and Apple for not allocating shares to him. And in the next version of the Red Herring, we printed the entire lawsuit on page 3. And it worked. He was so upset and so ashamed. He said, "I forget it. I don't want to."
Never mind.
Never mind. But, you know, I mean, that's the kind of thing. I mean, it also sends a lot of messages about how you think about stuff like that. You could have conjured up a lot of reasons why Charlie Finley was so important that we should have, you know, done something. And so, you know, I mean, each of the, everybody made a speech, everybody made a toast, and it was actually a bankrupt restaurant where we had the closing dinner. So we opened the restaurant for the party and hired a caterer.
Just so you could have privacy, or?
Yeah. Well, we needed a big place, and I mean, some creative kid said, you know, here's a choice, and so we did it. We had a piano player, and the guys at H&Q wrote a song. It was played, sung, still.
Any words that stick out on your mind of things that you said or others that kind of captured that moment?
I mean, it was it can't be terribly substantive. It was just a lot of gratitude and excitement and satisfaction. And what's next?
Speaking of that, so Apple is huge, and it sort of opened this floodgate for you. So talk about what followed in terms of the deals and your growth and your venture business.
Well, I think the story is a lot about the people who followed me. I mean, first was Mike Brooks, who took over actually running the high-tech investment banking stuff, and then Carter McClellan, and then Frank Quattrone, and then Michael Grimes. I mean, it's there you go. And it's all about the passion that those people had and have, and it was, I would say, critically important that the reputation that we came away with from doing the Apple IPO resonated around the Valley. And I think it was a moment in history where major Wall Street firms were needed, but nobody had actually bitten the bullet yet or figured out sort of how to do it. So we kind of led the way with Apple and showed the H&Q relationship to be important. And so I think one of the things that it did is the deals got bigger, and the managements respected the fact that they had these long relationships with Montgomery and H&Q and Robertson Stevens, that to get into the big time and do a really big deal, you needed a major firm. And So those partnerships became critical, and it would be misleading anybody to say that we did that all by ourselves. I mean, those firms brought us a lot of business, and we also developed relationships with the venture capital firms, who in those days, well, still, I suppose, have a serious vote on how the investment banker is chosen and what they do.
Do you want to say that? I think you had an early and very close relationship with Kleiner, right? Kleiner, Perkins, and how did that get started and how did that evolve? That was again something new, right? That kind of relationship.
Yeah. Well, here's the story. So my partner said, "Okay, Jack, venture capital. How do you do it?" And so I wrote a paper on how you do it. And one of the things that the paper said was, if I'm going to be responsible for starting this business, we are not going to do startups, because Morgan Stanley has built its culture and reputation on the permanence and the long-term viability of our clients. And if you're in the startup business, you have to shut companies down when they don't work. And my contention was we didn't know how to do that. And the worst thing you can do in the startup business is put more money into a company that's not going to make it. So they said, okay, that's fine. You're talking about getting into a world that we don't know, which is A rounds and B rounds and C rounds. So we wrote another paper that said, let's establish a relationship with the best firm in the industry that's good at doing startups. And if we're successful at doing that, we can follow on our investments with their successful investments. And if all of that works, it should lead to investment banking business as well. So I put together a slide deck, and the slide deck basically described why we thought Morgan Stanley should be in the venture capital business, and made a list of 12 firms and went around and presented to each of the 12 firms a case for us partnering with each one of them. And the tagline, which was the last slide in the presentation, said, if you're ever thinking of raising a really big fund, we would be interested in being your agent and raising the money and earning a small stake in your general partnership and going forward together. And actually literally the last pitch I made going across the country, Venrock and Mayfield and blah, 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 was Kleiner Perkins. And it was right down here in Embarcadero 4. And it was Tom Perkins by himself in the room. And I had given the last page in the slide deck a caption that said partnering, but it didn't say anything more because I wasn't sure what I was going to want to say until I actually got there. And when I got to that page, it was absolutely clear to me by the body language that Morgan Stanley and Kleiner Perkins had come out of actually come out of the same mold, and it was only a question of which one of us was more arrogant. And so when I got to that page, I said to Tom, and if you ever run into a young venture guy who needs help raising a fund, give me a call. And the phone rang next Wednesday, and it was Perkins on the phone. He said, Jack, I met the guy, and he's me.
Yeah. Went right through the door that you opened for him.
Oh, man. And he said, we want to do a $500 million fund. I mean, their last fund had been $70 million.
Had you floated that number, or did he?
Totally out of the air. And I mean, it was apocryphal. I mean, and then he had a reason why it should be 500, and he was going to seed firms all over the country, and they were going to create this, whole ecosystem. And my God, I mean, what was I? And here I am, sort of 3 years into the firm, and I said on the phone, "No problem, Tom."
Wow.
And I spent the next 2 weeks figuring out how to get it down to 150, which we then did. Yeah. And that is the story. I mean, the first fund at Morgan Stanley, which was a $50 million fund, was the best performing venture fund that probably done in history. I mean, it was like 20x or something, and it was all, cherry picking the Kleiner deals. And since then, we've probably done 50% of their IPOs. And, the day we started the roadshow, the first meeting was with AT&T in New York. The second meeting was Prudential out in New Jersey. And the guy at AT&T, I finally said, it was a good meeting, but, you couldn't tell. And I said, so at the elevator, I said, what do you think? I mean, does this kind of fit? And the guy said, I think 25. And the elevator doors closed, and Perkins said, did I hear what he said?
Was that?
Was that right? And John Doerr was carrying the slide box. And we then got to Prudential, and this guy, I knew him pretty well. Garnet Keith was his name. And we go into the meeting, we sit down, and he looks at Perkins. He said, what's Wadsworth doing here? And God, I had no thought where that might go. And Tom said, I am probably the best venture capitalist in the country at identifying startups. And I have applied that to the investment banking industry. And we need tech banking from the main firms in Wall Street. And this guy is a startup.
What better answer than that?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I was a little nervous. But, we had the deal done before we even got to Chicago.
You had too many flights planned.
Right.
Amazing. So there was this, I don't know if it's pent up, but this immediate positive response. And then just mention some of those deals that were in your first fund, those they were home runs.
Yeah.
Early on. Do you remember?
I can't remember a single name. I mean,
that's okay.
It's too long ago.
It's amazing. So you have this venture, you're working with Kleiner, and then you have Japan too, right? So, I mean, is this one?
Well, Japan happened in 1986. So
yeah. So
Kleiner was 82. That's when we did that.
I'm just saying that you have one major new building block in business after another that you.
Well, let me tell you, Brooke Byers is still a good friend, but they decided to do another fund in about 3 years, and they called and said, we're not going to use Morgan Stanley this time. And I flew all the way out to San Francisco to just scream at them. I was so mad because, we had said one of the reasons for us to do this is to get an exclusive relationship. So we won't do a fund for another firm. Fine. I mean, they didn't pay any attention to that. And during the period between when they told us they were going to do the next fund by themselves and when we did their fund, I must have gotten 3 or 4 calls from, including Dick Kramlich, will you do a fund for us? And I said, Dick, I'm sorry, we made a promise to Tom. And so it is a whole nother story, but what Tom said, okay, well, let's do something together. Research and development funds are really, really important. We're doing a lot of them at Genentech, and every biotech company should take advantage of these tax benefits. So let's do you know, a $100 million R&D fund, you know, that will run, and you know, when one of our portfolio companies, you know, needs to do an R&D fund, they won't have to hire, you know, 20 lawyers and spend 6 months, you know, raising the money. We'll just do it. And so we did it. And we raised $36 million for this R&D fund. And it was the dumbest thing it's one of those things that I put at the top of the list of dumb ideas. You know, it was impossible money to raise because, you know, most of the people who have money for stuff like that don't pay taxes. So,
Yep.
The boards of directors of a lot of these companies that you want to put the money in think that, you know, R&D financing is the bottom of the barrel. I mean, it's the last resort. So, you know, why they didn't want to do it. Anyway, I sort of after that experience coined the phrase that there are 3 kinds of private equity funds or venture funds. The ones that are easy to raise and easy to invest, hard to raise and easy to invest, and hard to raise and hard to invest. And steer clear of the last one.
Well, you had some great stories to tell about some of your partners on the entrepreneur side with Steve. Do you want to say something about your partners that you had on the VC side with Tom Perkins or John Doerr or the others? I mean, those were early days for both.
Yeah,
you know,
well,
pioneers.
immediately we hired a guy to run the venture fund. His name was Bill Murdy. He's still around, really smart guy. So I pretty much then moved on. And he was the guy who produced the good performance in the first fund and went on from there. Yeah.
So take us to 1986. Are we going to miss anything if we jump to 86 in Japan?
Yeah, probably, but no. I mean, that's...
I mean, in terms of another big,
Yeah.
significant thing that you started, you talk about the decision to seed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. This is, again, new territory, right? How did you make that decision, and what went into that? Because that was not an easy or obvious thing for the time.
Yeah, no, I agree. 1986, I'd say 2 things were going on in the Wadsworth corner. One is I was consciously sort of feeling a little bored, and since I'd gotten back into the deal business, I mean, I was perfectly motivated and satisfied about doing a lot of the stuff that I did, but it was sort of like, okay, another deal is, you know, another deal. What's going to be new about it? And being beyond my comfort zone is something that I have always thought about a little bit. And, you know, if you've been there before, why do it? So it was a kind of interesting moment from that point of view. And our youngest child, we have 3 kids, raised them in Brooklyn, was off to college in 1987. So the empty nester thing was, you know, looming. And Susie was teaching high school in Brooklyn, and she'd gotten a master's degree at NYU along the way. And so, you know, one Tuesday afternoon in a management committee meeting, we got word that the firm had been designated as one of the 6 firms to receive a seat on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. So the meeting was immediately convened about what to do. And the conversation didn't take long to get to who's going to do it. We had, I don't know, 5 or 6 people in Tokyo, all Japanese, all kind of, you know, historically doing this cyclical thing, and not a clue how to run a business of any consequence. And I remember saying that this is probably going to be one of the most challenging jobs that has ever come along for the firm. You have to have somebody who knows the back office, the front office, the trading, the systems, the regulation, the whole deal, and also knows Morgan Stanley and sort of kind of gets what it is that we're trying to do. And I'm just looking around the table. It's going to be a really tough person to hire. So Bob Greenhill, my buddy, said, "Jack, I have a different idea. It's you." And I remember saying, "That's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. I've got, no experience doing all this stuff, and plus which I'm busy, and I think I'm doing important stuff." Since we had paddled 6 Arctic canoe trips together, he said, "Well, why don't you go home and talk to Susie and then come back and let's talk about it at 7 o'clock in the morning." So I went home and I said, "Guess what?" And again, it's one of those seminal moments. She said, "Let's do it." I said, "Are you kidding?" She said, "No, let's do it. Sounds like a great challenge. And the kids are gone, so..."
Let's do it.
Literally, we put Christopher on his bunk at Williams and went to Kennedy Airport.
Literally.
Literally. And, this was hindsight, it's great, but it was, again, it was one of the great things simply because of the challenge and because of the blank piece of paper and all that sort of stuff. And it was great for our relationship. I mean, we started collecting Asian art and did all kinds of cool stuff. But I got to Japan and I really didn't have a plan. I didn't have a plan. I mean, I knew all of the infrastructure stuff that I had to do. So I identified, I spent 6 months before I went learning all that part of the business.
It's like starting over, right?
Huh?
I mean, it's so complicated. It's kind of like starting over.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, when you're in the trading business, it didn't take me very long to conclude that the most important thing a manager can know is whether you're net long or net short. And the way we have always run the trading business at Morgan Stanley is not to bet the market. I mean, every now and then you do it by mistake but it's never consciously, the interest rates are going up or down or the equity market, blah, blah, is going to do something. So that was a fairly clear thing that I knew I needed to understand. And, in 1987, the marvelous thing is that you could ask the trading floor that question and rely on the answer. When you got to 2008 and people are marking to program instead of market, and you ask the firm whether you're net long or net short, nobody has a clue. Yeah. That's why everybody went bust.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They didn't know. So anyway, the question really was the business model. And the 15 big banks in Japan, owned 80% of the banking market, and the big 4 securities firms owned 60% of the volume on the stock exchange. So what was I going to do? And spent about 2 months trying to figure that out and reached the conclusion that the only way for Morgan Stanley to make money in Japan would be to change the entire market, from an administered market to a market. So I had a really brilliant lawyer who spoke Japanese better than the Japanese, and he knew that he actually majored in Japanese history. He had a PhD. So when he and I went into the Ministry of Finance, they knew that he knew more than they did about their own history. So we made a list of 51 things that we wanted to change, including introducing a futures contract, two-way trading in treasuries, blah, 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 blah. I mean, everything that you needed to have to create a two-way market that could enable a smart firm to make money trading. And we teamed up with Goldman Sachs and Solomon, and we'd have a once-a-month meeting. And there was a guy named Tim Geithner who was then the Treasury attaché in the U.S. Embassy in Japan. he became our partner. And every time the Ministry of Finance said no, we'd go over to Tim and say.
Here we are.
And within 3 years, we had supply and demand driven financial markets in Japan. And when I got there, I mean, Morgan Stanley was a piddling little operation that, you know, had expenses and no revenues. And Nomura made $1 billion that year, 1987. And I left in 1991. We made $100 million, and Nomura lost money. They could not figure out what we were doing. They were on the wrong side of every trade. I used to ask the trader, so what happened at Nomura today? He said, well, they only carried 2 out on stretchers.
Only 2?
Only 2.
So this, this deregulation and the opening up of the capital markets is huge. Yeah.
Changed the country.
Changed the country.
And they still haven't quite figured it out. And I think it's one of the things that has led, frankly, to the long, kind of recession in Japan, because when the MITI told you what to invest in, and the Ministry of Finance told the banks what to lend to, you just had industrial companies that were doing stuff.
Sure, yeah, the national champions, industrial policy. And
yeah. All of a sudden, I remember getting a call once from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the finance guy, saying, for the first time any of us can remember, we have more projects than we have money. And so we're going to have to make some choices. And we've heard of something called discounted cash flow. Could you come over here and teach us?
This foreign concept.
Yeah, right. Anyway, it was an amazing period. And what, that leads into a conversation about China, because in Japan, our partners were Wall Street firms, and our enemy was the government. When I got to China, it was the reverse.
Had to be, right?
Yeah.